The rhythmic scratch of bristles against concrete echoed through the empty gym. Dawn had not yet broken over Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, but Richard Mack McAllister had already been working for 30 minutes. His
What are you
movements
gonna
were
do about it,
methodical,
old man?
practiced each sweep of the broom precise and economical. At 78, his body moved with the careful deliberation of age, but there remained something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders that hinted at a different kind of strength. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished floor of the SEAL training facility. Mac paused, leaning slightly on his broom, and glanced at the Bulova watch on his wrist. The timepiece was military issue, circa 1950, its face scratched and weathered, but still keeping perfect time. 0437 hours. He had plenty of time before the young warriors would arrive for their morning training. Another day, he whispered to himself, a ritual utterance that carried the weight of decades. Mac resumed his sweeping, moving toward the wrestling mats at the center of the gym. These were sacred spaces to the men who trained here, places where future Navy SEALs tested themselves against one another, forging the bonds that would carry them through the world's most dangerous missions. To Mac, it was just another area to be cleaned, another task in his daily routine. As he worked, his reflection caught in the wall of mirrors lining the gym. Mac rarely looked at himself anymore, avoiding the stranger who gazed back at him from reflective surfaces. But this morning, something made him pause. He straightened a process that seemed to involve each vertebra clicking reluctantly into place and faced his reflection. Time had not been gentle. His face was a roadmap of nearly 8 decades, deep lines etched around pale blue eyes that had seen too much. His hair, once dark brown, was now a thin silver crown. The maintenance uniform hung loosely on his frame, which had once been powerful but was now whittled down by age to something lean and wiry. As he adjusted his collar, the movement exposed a small portion of a faded tattoo on the back of his neck, just below his hairline. The ink had blurred over the decades, but the design was still discernible to those who knew what to look for: a trident intertwined with a sea serpent, its tail coiled around the base. The sight of it triggered a flash of memory, so vivid it made him blink: ice-cold seawater, the taste of salt, absolute darkness, and a blinding light. Max shook his head slightly, dispelling the image. Not now, not here. He turned away from the mirror and continued his work. Every morning followed the same pattern. Mac would rise at 0400 hours in his small bungalow, 2 miles from the base. Black coffee strong enough to stand a spoon and consumed while sitting at a small kitchen table. A moment of silence for Margaret, his wife of 47 years, gone now for 5. Then the drive to the base in his 1992 Ford Ranger, the American flag decal on its bumper, faded but still visible. Mac had been working as a maintenance man at the SEAL training facility for 3 years now. Most of the instructors nodded to him in passing, a courtesy extended without much thought. The trainees rarely noticed him at all, too focused on surviving the legendary brutality of SEAL training. That suited Mac just fine. Invisibility had its advantages. It allowed him to be close to the world he had once belonged to without having to engage with it directly. Each morning before leaving his house, Mac would touch the small key hanging alongside his house keys. It opened a room in his home that he had not entered in nearly 20 years. A room filled with memories too painful to revisit, but too important to discard. Not today, he would whisper to himself each morning. Maybe tomorrow. The sound of the main door opening pulled Mac from his thoughts. It was early for anyone to be arriving, not quite 500 yet. He continued sweeping his back to the entrance. "Morning, Mac," came a familiar voice. It was Dave, one of the civilian security guards who patrolled the base during the night shift. Mac nodded in acknowledgement. "Dave, quiet night." "As a graveyard." Dave chuckled at his own joke. "You're here early again." "Same time as always?" Dave shook his head in affectionate gesture. "You put these youngsters to shame. You know that I swear you work harder than half the kids who come through here." Mac didn't respond to the compliment, just continued his methodical sweeping. "Anyway," Dave continued, sensing Mac's discomfort with praise, "just wanted to let you know, Lieutenant Reynolds booked the gym for an early session today. Him and his hotshot squad have some kind of special training." Mac nodded. He knew Reynolds by sight. Young, ambitious, with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. The type who believed their place in the SEAL teams was predestined rather than earned. "Thanks for the heads up," Mac said. Dave departed with a wave, leaving Mac alone again with his broom and his thoughts. He quickened his pace slightly, wanting to finish the wrestling mats before Reynolds and his team arrived. But it was not to be. The double doors to the gym burst open 15 minutes later, and a group of 6 men in navy blue t-shirts and tactical pants strode in. At their lead was Lieutenant Jason Reynolds, 28 years old, 6'2" of sculpted muscle and unshakable self-assurance. His dark hair was cropped in a perfect military cut, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. Reynolds was the son of Admiral James Reynolds, a decorated Navy officer who had served with distinction in the Persian Gulf and beyond. The weight of family legacy sat heavily on the lieutenant's shoulders, a pressure he converted into an almost pathological need to prove himself. Currently, he was on the short list for DevGru selection, SEAL Team 6, the most elite unit within an already elite community. It would be the culmination of everything he had worked for, the ultimate validation. Reynolds spotted Mac immediately, his expression shifting from neutral to annoyed. The old janitor was in his space, interrupting his carefully planned morning. The other SEALs spread out, dropping their gear bags along the wall, watching their lieutenant to see how he would handle the situation. "Morning," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness of someone who expects immediate compliance. "We need the gym now. Base approved us for fun." Mac continued, sweeping, the rhythmic scraping of bristles against concrete the only reply. Reynolds frowned, glancing back at his men, several of whom were smirking. Being ignored was not something Lieutenant Reynolds experienced often, particularly not by civilian staff. "Hey," he said louder this time. "I'm talking to you. We need this space now." Mac paused, then resumed his sweeping, moving to the final corner of the wrestling mat area. Reynolds stepped forward, his patience evaporating. "Are you deaf, old man? I said move it." The words cut through the quiet hum of the gym, sharp and laced with the unearned confidence of youth. Mac finally stopped and slowly turned to face the younger man. His pale blue eyes met Reynolds' dark ones, his face expressionless. "Floor needs to be swept," Mac said, his voice raspy but clear. "Keeps the dust down. Better for breathing when you're exerting yourself." Reynolds blinked, taken aback by both the response and the calm, unintimidated manner in which it was delivered. This quiet defiance, this utter lack of fear, was something new to him. Reynolds, used to being the most formidable presence in any room, felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. The sensation of being dismissed. "You think I care about dust?" Reynolds scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. "I've been in conditions that would make you cry yourself to sleep. Now, for the last time, get out of the way." The surrounding SEALs, all young operators in their 20s and early 30s, were now fully invested in the confrontation. To them, this was a bit of casual sport, at the expense of the hired help, a reaffirmation of the pecking order. The strong versus the weak, the warrior versus the worker. Reynolds closed the distance until he was nearly chest to chest with the old janitor. Mac didn't back away, didn't change his expression. He simply stood there, broom in hand, with a dignity that seemed to infuriate Reynolds even more. "Look, Pops," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a low, condescending growl. "This isn't a nursing home. This is a place for warriors. We need the mat." With that, he pushed the end of Mac's broom, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound echoed in the gym, drawing the attention of a figure standing in the shadows near the weight racks. Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes had been observing the scene with practiced neutrality. At 47, Hayes was a command-level operator who had seen more than his share of combat zones in Afghanistan and Iraq. He had also seen more than his share of cocky young SEALs like Reynolds. Hayes rarely intervened in these sorts of contests, believing that a little friction helped forge stronger men. But there was something in the old janitor's bearing that caught his attention. The way he stood, the set of his shoulders, the utterly fearless gaze. It wasn't the posture of a cowed civilian. It was the stance of a man who had faced far worse than an arrogant young lieutenant. Mac looked down at his fallen broom, then back up at Reynolds. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound weariness, a deep and abiding disappointment. He bent down to retrieve his broom, his movements careful and measured. As he did, the collar of his uniform shifted, pulled taut by the movement. For a fleeting second, the skin on the back of his neck was exposed. The tattoo, faded but distinctive, was fully visible for a moment. Reynolds didn't notice, too consumed by his perceived victory. "That's better," he sneered. "Now you're learning." But Hayes saw it. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the design. Not just any trident, but a very specific variation intertwined with a sea serpent. It was a mark he had seen before, not in person, but in books and grainy photographs from a bygone era of naval warfare. It was the symbol of the underwater demolition teams, the UDTs, the frogmen who had preceded the SEAL teams. But the particular coiling of the serpent signified something else, something Hayes had only heard about in whispers and legends, a specialized unit that operated in the shadows during the Korean War. Hayes pushed himself off the weight rack, his workout forgotten, and strode purposefully toward the confrontation. Mac had retrieved his broom and was turning to leave his face a mask of dignified resignation. Reynolds, emboldened by what he saw as submission, wasn't finished. "You know we should get you a new uniform," he said loudly to his friends, though his words were aimed at Mac. "Maybe one with a little bib on the front in case you drool." A few of the younger SEALs laughed, though not all of them. One or two were beginning to look uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. Hayes stepped into the circle of men, his presence immediately changing the dynamic. At 6 feet even, he wasn't as tall as Reynolds, but he carried the unmistakable gravity of a man who had spent decades in the most elite fighting force on Earth. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a scar running along his jawline from a close encounter with an enemy blade in Fallujah. "That's enough, Lieutenant," Hayes said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that instantly cut through the lingering bravado. Reynolds snapped to a semblance of attention, years of military training taking over. "Master Chief, we were just clearing the area for our training session." Hayes ignored him, his gaze fixed on Mac, who had stopped at the sound of the Master Chief's voice. "Sir," Hayes said, addressing the janitor with unexpected formality, "could I ask you your name?" Mac hesitated, then responded, "Richard McAllister." Hayes nodded slowly, his eyes moving to the spot on Mac's neck, where the tattoo was partially visible beneath his collar. "And you served Mr. McAllister?" There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken history. "A lifetime ago," Mac finally said. The younger SEALs exchanged confused glances. Reynolds looked irritated at the interruption and the inexplicable respect Hayes was showing to the janitor. "UDT?" Hayes asked, his voice soft with something approaching reverence. Mac gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Hayes turned to Reynolds, his expression hardening. "Lieutenant, take your men to the obstacle course. Your training session is postponed." "But Master Chief, we have the gym reserved," Reynolds began to protest. "That wasn't a suggestion, Lieutenant." Hayes cut him off, his voice now carrying a steel edge. "Obstacle course. Now." Reynolds clenched his jaw but knew better than to challenge Hayes directly. He gestured sharply to his team, who began gathering their gear, casting curious glances back at the old janitor and the Master Chief. "This isn't over," Reynolds muttered as he passed Mac low enough that Hayes couldn't hear. Once the SEALs had exited the gym, Hayes turned his full attention back to Mac. "Mr. McAllister," he said, "I apologize for the behavior of that officer. It was unacceptable." Mac just nodded, seemingly eager to return to his work in anonymity. Hayes hesitated, then gestured to Mac's neck. "That tattoo, it's not just any UDT mark, is it?" Mac's hand instinctively went to his collar, adjusting it to better cover the ink. His eyes, previously calm, now held a wariness. "It was a long time ago, Master Chief. With all due respect, sir, I think I know what that symbol represents. The serpent coiled that way. You were part of the Phantom Trident unit, weren't you?" Mac's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even fear. He had spent decades burying those memories, that identity. Now, in the space of a few minutes, his carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling. "I need to finish my work," Mac said, turning away. Hayes didn't press the issue directly, sensing the older man's discomfort, but he couldn't let it go entirely. The Phantom Trident was a legend in naval special warfare circles, a ghost story told to new recruits, a team so secretive their missions were erased from official records. Finding one of them alive, sweeping a gym floor, it was unthinkable. "Sir, I need to make a call," Hayes said. "Would you mind waiting here for a few minutes? I believe the base commander would want to speak with you." Mac paused, then gave a resigned sigh. "I've been mopping these floors for 3 years, Master Chief. Nobody's cared who I was before today. I'd prefer to keep it that way." Hayes looked at him with genuine respect. "I understand, sir, but some things are bigger than personal preference. If you are who I think you are, then there's been a gross oversight in how you've been treated." Mac didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. He simply resumed sweeping as if the conversation had never happened. Hayes stepped away, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. He stepped into the corridor outside the gym, giving Mac a measure of privacy. "Colonel Franklin, Master Chief Hayes here. I'm at the SEAL gym," Hayes said, his voice low and urgent. "Sir, you need to come down here right now." There was a pause as the commander responded on the other end. "No, sir, there's no emergency, not in the traditional sense." Hayes glanced back through the gym doors at Mac, who was methodically continuing his work. "Do you know who the janitor is here? An older fellow named Richard McAllister." Another pause as Franklin presumably searched his memory. "Well, sir," Hayes continued, his voice dropping even lower, "I just saw a tattoo on his neck. A coiled serpent around a trident. It's a UDT mark, sir, but it's more than that. I think he might be one of the Phantom Trident unit members." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Hayes could almost feel the shock radiating through the phone. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Franklin's voice finally returned, stripped of all casualness. "Don't let him leave." Hayes ended the call and returned to the gym where Mac was finishing up the wrestling mat area, seemingly oblivious to the storm he had inadvertently triggered. The Master Chief simply stood and watched a Guardian, now waiting for a history he had only read about, to come crashing into the present. Inside his office, at the heart of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, Colonel James Franklin stared at his phone, the Master Chief's words still echoing in his ear. Phantom Trident. It was a designation he hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, an operational name that existed now only in classified archives and whispered legends. Franklin, a career naval officer with 30 years of service, had read about the unit during his time at the Naval War College. They were part of the maritime history that every senior officer absorbed, the evolutionary link between the World War II frogmen and the modern SEAL teams. But Phantom Trident was more myth than history, a specialized three-man team rumored to have undertaken missions so sensitive that most records of their existence were purged. The colonel immediately swiveled in his chair and logged into a secure Naval Archives database. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he typed in the name Richard McAllister. The initial search came back with minimal information. A standard service record from 1950 to 1954, honorable discharge, basic UDT qualifications. Nothing special, nothing to suggest involvement in highly classified operations. But Franklin knew that the most sensitive records were often buried, protected by layers of archaic classifications and need-to-know barriers. He initiated a deeper search using a command-level override code that he rarely employed. This time, a single flagged file appeared. It was heavily redacted, most of it blacked out, but one line was clearly visible. Operation Phantom Trident, Wonson Harbor Infiltration, Octane 25, 1950. Sole survivor, see addendum file X-ray 7. Franklin didn't have clearance for X-ray 7. Nobody below the level of a Navy admiral did. His blood ran cold at the implications. The janitor sweeping his gym floor was the sole survivor of a ghost operation, a mission so classified that even nearly 75 years later, its details remained hidden. He grabbed his cover and was out the door in seconds, his mind reeling. The quiet dignity Mac displayed, the utter lack of fear when confronted by Reynolds, the way Hayes had described his bearing. It all made a terrifying kind of sense now. Back in the gym, Lieutenant Reynolds, his ego still smarting from the Master Chief's dismissal, decided he wasn't quite finished. He had ordered his team to wait at the obstacle course, telling them he needed to retrieve something from his locker. It was a lie. What Reynolds needed was to reassert his dominance, to show that he wasn't intimidated by Hayes or anyone else. He strode back into the gym where Mac was still cleaning, with Hayes standing nearby like a sentinel. "Hey, Pops," Reynolds said, his voice dripping with false concern. "You should be careful. All this dust can't be good for a man your age. We wouldn't want you to have a fall, would we?" He looked at Hayes, a silent challenge. "Maybe it's time for you to be in a home. We could even call them for you. Have you evaluated to make sure your mind is still sound?" It was a vile, cruel insinuation, a direct attack on Mac's age and competence. Reynolds had crossed a line, moving from simple arrogance to outright malice. Hayes's jaw tightened, and he took a half-step forward, but Mac subtly raised a hand, stopping him. The old janitor looked at the young SEAL, and for the first time, there was something other than weariness in his eyes. It was a flicker of pity. Just as Reynolds opened his mouth to say something more, the main doors to the gym burst open. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous space. Standing there was Colonel Franklin, his expression grim and resolute. Behind him were two Marine guards in full dress uniform, white gloves, and all their presence a shocking and inexplicable sight in the middle of a SEAL training facility. And behind them, visible through the open doors, was the commander's official vehicle, a black sedan with flags mounted on the fenders, its lights still flashing. The few remaining personnel in the gym froze. This was a level of command presence that was almost never seen on the training floor. This was not a casual visit. It was an arrival. Colonel Franklin strode directly toward the scene, his eyes locked on Richard McAllister. He ignored Reynolds completely, as if the young SEAL were nothing more than a piece of gym equipment. He ignored Hayes as well. His entire world in that moment had narrowed to the quiet, unassuming janitor holding a broom. The colonel stopped directly in front of Mac. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture ramrod straight. The Marine guards took up positions on either side of the entrance, their faces impassive. The gym was utterly silent. Franklin's eyes scanned Mac's face, then dipped for a fraction of a second to the faded tattoo on his neck. His own expression was a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had seen the redacted file. He knew who he was standing in front of. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the room, Colonel Franklin, the commanding officer of the entire Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, snapped his heels together and rendered a sharp, perfect salute. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was the salute one renders to a Medal of Honor recipient, to a visiting dignitary, to a figure of immense and profound importance. The two Marine guards, seeing their commander's action, followed suit, their white-gloved hands slicing through the air in unison. "Mr. McAllister," Colonel Franklin said, his voice clear and ringing with authority. "I am Colonel Franklin. I want to personally and professionally apologize for the disrespect you have been shown in this facility." He held the salute, his eyes locked on Max. Reynolds was frozen, his mouth agape, his face a mask of utter confusion and horror. Master Chief Hayes stood at a respectful distance, a look of profound vindication on his face. Mac, for his part, looked deeply uncomfortable with the attention. His eyes darted to the door as if measuring his chances of escape. But there was also something else in his gaze, a reluctant acceptance that the life he had built for himself, the anonymity he had cultivated, was now irrevocably altered. The colonel lowered his salute but remained at attention. For the benefit of those who are unaware, he announced, his voice now booming through the silent gym. "This is Richard McAllister. Before he was a janitor here, he was a frogman. He was part of an underwater demolition team during the Korean War." Franklin paused, letting the words sink in. "He was a member of a specialized three-man team under a clandestine program known as Operation Phantom Trident." The name hung in the air, exotic and mysterious. Reynolds' confusion was evident. He had never heard of such a unit, but Hayes nodded slightly, his suspicions confirmed. "Their mission, which is still largely classified," Franklin continued, "was to swim into the harbor at Wonsan, North Korea, ahead of the main invasion force, and disable the submarine nets and mine clusters protecting the harbor. They did this with no breathing apparatus, using only knives and handmade explosives in near-freezing water under the cover of darkness." The sheer audacity of such a mission began to register on the faces of those listening. Even Reynolds, in his arrogance, could appreciate the insane courage such a task would require. He then swam for another 2 hours, evading capture, and was the sole survivor of his unit to return to friendly lines. Franklin's voice grew solemn. For his actions, he was secretly awarded the Navy Cross, an award he never spoke of, for a mission that was erased from the books to protect operational security. Franklin's gaze hardened as he turned to face Reynolds. He is not just a veteran. He is a hero of the highest caliber, and he deserves nothing less than the absolute and unwavering respect of every single person on this base. The story hung in the air, a stunning testament to the quiet man holding the broom. Reynolds, his face now pale with shame and awe, could not meet Mac's eyes. Franklin turned his gaze, now cold as steel, onto the petrified lieutenant. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "are a disgrace to that uniform. You mistake arrogance for strength. You mistake age for weakness. This man, this hero you chose to mock and belittle, has more valor in his little finger than you have in your entire body." The colonel's voice rose again, addressing Hayes now. "Master Chief, you will personally escort Lieutenant Reynolds to my office. He is on report. He will issue a formal written apology to Mr. McAllister." And starting Monday, every single operator in this command, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned veteran, will attend a mandatory course on naval history with a specific focus on the contributions of the UDT and the men who built the legacy that you all take for granted. He then turned back to Mac, his expression softening once more. "Mr. McAllister," he said gently, "from the bottom of my heart, I am sorry." Mac finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, carrying across the silent gym. "Son," he said, looking not at the commander, but at the shamefaced Reynolds, "respect isn't in the uniform you wear. It's in how you wear it." His pale blue eyes, which had seemed so tired before, now burned with an inner fire. "The strongest man isn't the one who can lift the most weight. It's the one who can lift others up." He looked down at the simple broom in his hands. "There's no shame in any job as long as you do it with dignity." The faded tattoo on Mac's neck seemed to burn brighter in that moment, a testament to that dignity born in the crucible of war, a symbol of a promise made in the face of impossible odds, a permanent private medal of valor that no enemy could take and no bureaucrat could erase. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the high windows of the gym, they illuminated an old man standing tall, a symbol of a forgotten era of warfare now thrust reluctantly back into the light. The past had collided with the present, and nothing would be the same again. The silence that followed Mac's words hung in the air like smoke after artillery fire. The gym, normally alive with the sounds of exertion and determination, had fallen utterly quiet. Colonel Franklin stood at attention, absorbing the quiet dignity of the man before him. Reynolds remained frozen in place, his face a mask of shock and dawning humiliation. Master Chief Hayes watched it all with the measured gaze of a man who had seen the pendulum of justice swing at last. Mac shifted uncomfortably under the attention. For 3 years he had moved through this facility like a ghost, present but unseen. Now suddenly every eye was upon him. The identity he had carefully packed away had been pulled into the light, exposing parts of himself he had long ago decided to bury. "Mr. McAllister," Colonel Franklin said, breaking the silence, "would you join me in my office? There are matters we should discuss privately." It wasn't truly a request despite the phrasing. Mac recognized an order when he heard one, regardless of how politely it was couched. He nodded once, setting his broom carefully against the wall. "Master Chief Hayes," Franklin continued, "please escort Lieutenant Reynolds to the anteroom of my office. I'll deal with him after speaking with Mr. McAllister." Hayes nodded crisply. "Aye, sir." He turned to Reynolds, whose complexion had gone from red with anger to ashen with shame. "Let's go, Lieutenant." As they departed, Mac followed Colonel Franklin through the corridors of the base. The two Marines flanked them in a formal escort, an honor that made Mac increasingly uncomfortable. He had spent decades avoiding precisely this kind of recognition. Now it was being thrust upon him whether he wanted it or not. Personnel they passed in the hallway stopped and stared at the unusual procession. A janitor being escorted by the base commander and 2 dressed Marines was not a sight one saw every day at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Franklin's office occupied a corner of the administration building with windows overlooking both the bay and the training grounds. It was a space that reflected its occupant, orderly, professional, with careful touches of naval history displayed in shadow boxes and framed photographs. A model of a swift boat sat on one shelf. Above it hung a photograph of UDT frogmen from World War II, grinning shirtless on the deck of a Navy vessel, their bodies lean and their eyes squinting in the Pacific sun. "Please have a seat, Mr. McAllister," Franklin said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned before his desk. The Marines remained outside, closing the door to give the men privacy. Mac sat stiffly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. His eyes reflexively scanned the room, noting exits, cover positions, potential weapons. Old habits ingrained by training and hardened by combat never truly disappeared. Franklin settled into his chair and leaned forward, elbows on his desk, fingers steepled before him. His gaze was both assessing and respectful. "I must apologize again for Lieutenant Reynolds' behavior," he began. "That kind of disrespect is unacceptable in any circumstance, but especially towards someone of your background." Mac shook his head slightly. "No special treatment necessary, Colonel. I'm a maintenance worker here, that's all." Franklin's expression tightened. "With all due respect, sir, that is not all you are." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder, setting it on the desk between them. "I accessed your service record then after Master Chief Hayes called me. The basic file is unremarkable. 4 years of service, honorable discharge, standard UDT training. Mac's face remained impassive. He knew what was in that file because he had helped craft it himself all those years ago. The cover story, the official narrative that hid the truth. But there was a flag, Franklin continued, a reference to another file one I don't have clearance to access. Operation Phantom Trident, and a notation, sole survivor. At those words, Mac felt a familiar constriction in his chest. Memories he had spent a lifetime containing threatened to spill over. The cold water, the absolute darkness, the sounds that water made when it carried the report of gunshots, and the silence afterward more terrible than any noise could ever be. That was a long time ago, Colonel, Max said, his voice steady despite the turmoil beneath the surface. 75 years isn't long enough to forget the kind of service you rendered, Franklin replied. The Navy hasn't forgotten even if the records are sealed. The unit you were part of, it's spoken of in whispers among those of us who study the history of naval special warfare. Mac looked out the window toward the bay, where the morning sun was now glittering off the water. Most of the whispers are probably wrong. History has a way of becoming legend, and legend has a way of straying from the truth. Franklin nodded, conceding the point. Perhaps, but I know enough to understand that you and your team undertook missions that were deemed impossible. The ones in harbor operation alone. Mac's eyes snapped back to Franklin's, sharp and suddenly alert. That information is still classified. Only portions of it, Franklin corrected gently. The basic outline of the Wanzen landing is taught at the War College. What isn't taught is the role your team played in ensuring its success. Mac fell silent, wrestling with ghosts he had kept at bay for decades. Mr. McAllister, Franklin said after a moment, I've been the commander of this base for 3 years, the same amount of time you've worked here. How is it possible that I never knew who you were? A faint smile touched the corner of Mac's mouth. That was by design, Colonel. When I applied for the maintenance position, I used my service record but didn't highlight my UDT experience. Just listed it as naval service. Most people see an old man with a mop and don't ask many questions. But why? Franklin seemed genuinely perplexed. Why hide who you are? The men and women on this base would hold you in the highest esteem if they knew. Mac's expression hardened slightly. I didn't come here for esteem, Colonel. I came here because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because I needed to be close to it again. The water, the training, the purpose. My wife Margaret passed 5 years ago. Our daughter Sarah lives in Oregon with her family. After Margaret was gone, the house was too quiet. I needed something to fill the days. Franklin nodded slowly, beginning to understand. So you came to the place that shaped you, but chose to remain anonymous. Some ghosts are best left undisturbed, Max said quietly, and some memories are private. Franklin studied the older man, seeing beyond the maintenance uniform to the warrior underneath. Despite his age, Max sat with perfect posture, his gaze direct and unwavering. The colonel made a decision. Mr. McAllister, I understand your desire for privacy, and I respect it. But in light of what happened this morning, I believe we have an opportunity here. An opportunity to correct an oversight and to teach our current generation of SEALs something they desperately need to learn. Mac raised an eyebrow, wary. We're developing a new underwater combat training program, Franklin explained. One that combines traditional skills with modern technology. The men we train today rely heavily on equipment, rebreathers, tactical communications, GPS navigation. All crucial tools, but tools that can fail. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. What they lack is what you and your generation had in abundance, the ability to operate with nothing but your wits, your courage, and your bare hands. The mental fortitude that comes not from gadgets, but from inside. He tapped his chest for emphasis. Mac understood where this was heading and shook his head. I'm 78 years old, Colonel. My operational days are long behind me. I'm not asking you to swim into enemy harbors, Franklin said with a smile. I'm asking you to share your knowledge, to teach, to help us bridge the gap between the frogmen of yesterday and the SEALs of today. Before Mac could respond, a knock came at the door. Franklin's expression flickered with annoyance at the interruption. Enter, he called. His adjutant, a sharp-looking lieutenant commander, stepped in. Sorry to interrupt, sir, but Admiral Reynolds is on the secure line. He's asking about his son. Franklin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tell him I'll call him back in 20 minutes. Sir, he was quite insistent. 20 minutes, Commander, Franklin repeated firmly. The adjutant nodded and withdrew. Franklin turned back to Mac with a sigh. Politics, he said by way of explanation. Lieutenant Reynolds' father is Admiral James Reynolds, Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. A good officer in his own right, but perhaps too protective of his son's career. Mac nodded, understanding the complex dynamics at play. The military was a meritocracy in theory, but in practice, family connections and political considerations often held sway. What do you want from me exactly? Mac asked, returning to the colonel's proposal. Initially a consultation role, Franklin said. Meet with our training staff, share your expertise on underwater infiltration techniques that don't rely on modern equipment. If that goes well, perhaps some classroom instruction for our trainees. Mac considered the offer. The idea of stepping out of the shadows, of reclaiming even a small portion of his former identity, was both tempting and terrifying. For decades, he had been the quiet man with the broom, invisible and unnoticed. The role had become comfortable, safe. I need time to think about it, he finally said. Franklin nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. He paused, then added, there's one more thing, Mr. McAllister. Lieutenant Reynolds. Mac's expression remained neutral. What about him? He's going to face disciplinary action for his behavior this morning. It will likely impact his candidacy for advanced selection. Franklin studied Mac carefully. Unless you were to speak on his behalf. Mac raised an eyebrow. You want me to defend him after how he acted? Not defend, Franklin clarified, but perhaps provide context for a valuable lesson learned. Young men like Reynolds sometimes need to fail before they can truly succeed. This could be a formative moment for him rather than a career-ending one. Mac understood. Franklin was offering him the opportunity to shape not just the training program, but the character of a young officer who had lost his way. I'll consider that as well, Mac said. Franklin stood, signaling the end of their meeting. Thank you for your time, Mr. McAllister. And if I may say so, it's an honor to have you on this base in whatever capacity you choose to serve. Mac rose stiffly, his joints protesting the movement. Thank you, Colonel, but for now I have floors to finish mopping. Franklin smiled, recognizing the dignity in Mac's commitment to his current duties, however humble they might seem. Of course, I'll have someone escort you back to the gym. As Mac turned to leave, Franklin added, and Mr. McAllister, whether or not you accept my offer, I hope you'll allow us to properly recognize your service, even if it's just among the senior staff. Mac paused at the door. Some forms of recognition are private, Colonel, like this. He touched the back of his neck, where the faded tattoo lay hidden beneath his collar. It means more when it's not for show. With that, he departed, leaving Franklin to contemplate the extraordinary man who had been hiding in plain sight on his base for 3 years. Outside in the anteroom, Lieutenant Reynolds sat rigid and pale, awaiting his fate. When he saw Mac emerge from the colonel's office, he stood awkwardly, his arrogance replaced by genuine remorse. Mr. McAllister, he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, Mac replied simply. Sometimes silence is better than words. Hayes, who had been standing guard over Reynolds, watched the exchange with interest. I'll escort Mr. McAllister back to his work area, Hayes said. Lieutenant Reynolds, you wait here for the colonel. Reynolds nodded, sinking back into his chair as Mac and Hayes departed. The young SEAL's world had been turned upside down in the space of an hour. His certainties shattered, his ambitions suddenly in jeopardy. As Mac and Hayes walked through the quarters, the Master Chief maintained a respectful silence for several minutes before finally speaking. If you don't mind me asking, sir, the Phantom Trident unit, I've only heard rumors. 3-man teams operating behind enemy lines, missions so classified they were conducted without official acknowledgement. Mac glanced at him. Most rumors have a grain of truth, Master Chief, but some things are still not for open discussion, even after all these years. Hayes nodded, accepting the gentle rebuff. I understand, sir. Men like you paved the way for what we do today. The modern SEAL teams stand on the shoulders of the UDT frogmen. We owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Mac stopped walking and turned to face Hayes directly. You repay it by doing your job, Master Chief, by living up to the standard. by teaching the young ones the meaning of honor and sacrifice. He glanced back in the direction they had come from. Even the difficult ones like Reynolds. Hayes smiled slightly. He's a hard case, that one. Talented, but he thinks he's entitled to respect rather than having to earn it. His kind often learn the hardest but most necessary lessons, Mac observed. Privilege can be a burden as much as a blessing. They resumed walking, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Hayes spoke of his own career, his deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, the changes he had seen in the teams over the decades. Mac listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp mind still keenly interested in the evolution of naval special warfare. When they reached the gym, Hayes paused at the entrance. "Mr. McAllister, regardless of what you decide about the Colonel's offer, it would be an honor if you'd join me for coffee sometime. I'd value the chance to learn from your experience." Mac considered the invitation, then nodded. "I'd like that, Master Chief. Though I warn you, my coffee is strong enough to float a horseshoe." Hayes grinned. "The only way to drink it, sir." As Hayes departed, Mac returned to his broom and his routine, but he could feel that something fundamental had shifted. His carefully constructed anonymity had been stripped away. The past, which he had kept at bay for so long, was now surging forward like a tide that could no longer be held back. 3 days passed in which Mac continued his maintenance duties as usual, though he was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere around him. Word had spread throughout the base, as it inevitably would. Junior officers who had previously walked past him without a glance now nodded respectfully. Enlisted personnel stood a little straighter when he entered a room. Mac found the attention uncomfortable but endured it with stoic grace. In the evenings, he returned to his small bungalow and sat on the porch, watching the sunset and contemplating Franklin's offer. On the third evening, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mac was sitting in his usual spot, a cup of black coffee cooling on the small table beside him, when a vehicle pulled up to the curb. It was a sleek black Audi, conspicuously expensive, obviously out of place in the modest neighborhood. Lieutenant Reynolds emerged, now dressed in civilian clothes, pressed khakis and a polo shirt that spoke of privilege and old money. He stood for a moment beside his car, visibly uncertain, before squaring his shoulders and approaching the porch. Mac watched him come, neither welcoming nor rejecting, simply observing. "Mr. McAllister," Reynolds said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "I hope I'm not intruding." "That depends on why you're here," Mac replied evenly. Reynolds swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize, properly, not because the Colonel ordered me to, but because I need to." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "What I did, how I treated you, it was inexcusable." Max studied the younger man's face, looking for sincerity beneath the polished exterior. "Apology accepted, Lieutenant. Is that all?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir. I've been doing some thinking and some research." Mac raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I went to the base library," Reynolds continued. "I looked up everything I could find about the UDT units in Korea. There wasn't much on the Phantom Trident specifically, but what I did find..." He shook his head in genuine awe. "The conditions you operated under, the missions you took on with equipment we'd consider primitive today. It's humbling." "War often is," Mac observed, "especially when you strip away the technology and face the raw elements." Reynolds nodded. "That's actually why I'm here. I heard the Colonel offered you a position as a consultant for our underwater training program. I wanted to tell you that I hope you'll accept." Mac's expression betrayed mild surprise. "Why would you want that after our introduction?" Reynolds looked down, then met Mac's eyes directly. "Because I need to learn what you know. Not just the techniques, but the mindset, the things that can't be taught in a manual or programmed into a simulation." For the first time, Mac saw something genuine in the young officer, a flicker of self-awareness, a recognition of his own limitations. It was the beginning of wisdom, the first crack in the facade of arrogance. "Come up and sit," Mac said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Reynolds climbed the steps and settled into the chair, his posture still military straight despite the civilian clothes. "Tell me why you became a SEAL lieutenant," Mac said. "The real reason, not the recruitment poster version." Reynolds was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "My father is Admiral James Reynolds. My grandfather was Captain William Reynolds. There's been a Reynolds in the Navy since the Civil War." He paused. The expectation was always there, unspoken but unmistakable. Excel, achieve, uphold the family name. Mac nodded, understanding, and the SEAL teams were the ultimate achievement. Yes, Reynolds admitted, though I did want it for myself too, not just for the family legacy, the challenge, the elite status being part of something special. Nothing wrong with ambition, Mac said, but there's a difference between confidence and arrogance, between earning respect and demanding it. Reynolds winced slightly at the gentle rebuke. I'm learning that lesson the hard way. Sometimes that's the only way it sticks, Mac observed. He took a sip of his coffee, then asked, what did the colonel decide about your disciplinary action? Reynolds straightened. I'm on probation for 60 days, removed from consideration for DevGru selection this cycle, and I've been assigned to organize and lead the new Naval History course for all personnel. Mac couldn't help but smile at the elegant punishment Franklin had devised. Poetic justice. Yes, sir, Reynolds agreed ruefully. I've been spending every free hour in the archives studying the history of naval special warfare from the beginning. The beach jumpers, the naval combat demolition units, the underwater demolition teams. He shook his head. I had no idea. We learned the basics in training, but not the details, not the personal stories. History fades, Mac said quietly. Men die. Records are sealed or lost. All that remains are fragments and legends growing more distant with each passing year. A contemplative silence fell between them. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and purples. From Mac's porch, they could just see a sliver of ocean between the houses across the street. Mr. McAllister, Reynolds finally said, would you tell me about them? Your team, I mean. The men you served with in Phantom Trident. The question hung in the air, fraught with significance. Mac had not spoken of Whiskey and Doc to anyone in decades, not even to Margaret in all their years of marriage. Some memories were too painful, too private to share. And yet, sitting there in the gathering dusk with this flawed but perhaps salvageable young officer, Mac felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps the stories needed to be told before they were lost forever. Michael Wilson, Mac said softly. We called him Whiskey. And James Thompson, Doc. Not because he was a medic, but because he had 2 years of medical school before he enlisted. He smiled faintly at the memory. Smartest man I ever knew. Could calculate tide tables in his head. Spoke Korean well enough to pass for a local in the dark. Reynolds listened intently, not interrupting, sensing the rarity of what he was being offered. We were brought together in early 1950, Mac continued. Hand-selected from the UDT ranks by a commander who had been with the original Navy combat demolition units in World War II. He had an idea for a specialized infiltration team operating deeper and darker than the standard UDT units. Mac's eyes grew distant, seeing not the sunset before him, but the past unspooling in his memory. We trained for 6 months on an island in the Pacific, learned to swim 5 miles in open ocean without fins, to navigate underwater using only the feel of current and the taste of the water, to place explosives while holding our breath for minutes at a time. He touched the back of his neck where the tattoo lay hidden. The night before our first mission, our commander brought out a bottle of whiskey and a makeshift tattoo kit. Said the Navy would never acknowledge what we were about to do, never give us medals or recognition. So he gave us this instead, the coiled serpent around the trident. Our private symbol, our secret brotherhood. Reynolds leaned forward. And once in harbor. What really happened? Mac's expression clouded. He was silent for so long that Reynolds thought he had pushed too far. But then the older man began to speak, his voice low and measured, recounting events that had been classified for 3/4 of a century. October 25th, 1950. The main assault on Wonsan was delayed because the harbor was heavily mined. Conventional minesweeping operations were proving too slow, too visible. Command needed a covert option to take out the submarine nets and marker buoys that were guiding the North Korean mine-laying operations. He described how they had been transported to the insertion point on a submarine, how they had slipped into the freezing water at midnight with nothing but nice waterproof explosives and the clothes on their backs. The water temperature was just above freezing, Mac recalled. Without modern wetsuits, we had perhaps 30 minutes before hypothermia would set in. The swim to the harbor entrance was 2 miles. The math didn't favor survival. He described the absolute darkness beneath the water, the way they stayed together by feeling the current changes created by each other's movements, the careful navigation by counting swim strokes and sensing the gradually changing salinity as they approached the harbor. We reached the first submarine net and began attaching the explosives. Mac continued, Whiskey on the left section, Doc on the right, me in the center. We had synchronized our watches and planned to detonate simultaneously once we were clear. His voice grew softer. That's when the patrol boat passed overhead. Its searchlights swept the water, and somehow they spotted movement. Maybe a reflection, maybe just bad luck. Reynolds was completely still absorbed in the account. They started dropping depth charges, small ones designed for divers rather than submarines. The underwater concussion could rupture eardrums, could stun you long enough to drown. Mac's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Doc and Whiskey were still placing their charges. They knew if they left their positions, the mission would fail. Mac fell silent, the weight of the memory pressing down on him like the crushing pressure of deep water. They created a diversion, Reynolds said quietly, understanding dawning in his eyes. They deliberately drew attention to themselves to give you time to finish. Mac nodded once his jaw tight. I heard them moving away from their positions, swimming hard toward the mouth of the harbor. The patrol boat followed. There were shots fired. He swallowed hard. Underwater gunfire sounds like metallic pings, distorted and strange. I knew what it meant, but I couldn't stop. I had to finish placing the charges, had to complete the mission. The sun had set completely now, twilight deepening around them. Neither man moved to turn on a light, as if the growing darkness was appropriate for the story being told. I detonated the charges and swam for the extraction point. 2 hours in near freezing water, constantly diving to avoid patrols. By the time I reached our rendezvous coordinates, I was nearly unconscious from hypothermia. The submarine almost missed me. Mac's voice grew distant. I spent a week in the infirmary. When I was debriefed, they told me search parties had found no trace of Whiskey or Doc. They were listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The official records stated they were lost during a training exercise off the coast of Japan. Reynolds absorbed this in silence, beginning to understand the weight Mac had carried for 75 years. The mission had been a success. The harbor defenses were compromised, allowing the landing at Wonsan to proceed. But the personal cost had been beyond measure. Before we deployed, Mac said, the three of us made a pact. We each carried something that belonged to another team member. Whiskey had Doc's medical school ring. Doc had my father's watch, and I had Whiskey's compass, a brass one that had belonged to his grandfather. He looked directly at Reynolds. We promised that if any of us didn't make it back, the survivors would keep those items as a pledge never to forget. Do you still have it? Reynolds asked softly. The compass, Mac nodded. In a box I haven't opened since I was discharged, along with a letter the three of us wrote and sealed to be opened only if just one of us survived. His voice grew rough. I've never had the courage to read it. Reynolds understood now why Mac had chosen anonymity, why he had buried his past so completely. It wasn't just about modesty or privacy. It was about survivor's guilt, about the terrible burden of being the one who came back when others didn't. Thank you for telling me, sir, Reynolds said, genuine respect in his voice. I know it couldn't have been easy. Mac looked at the young officer, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Beneath the privilege and arrogance was a man struggling to find his path, to live up to expectations both external and internal. Not so different, perhaps, from what Mac himself had once been. Lieutenant, Mac said, I've been considering the colonel's offer. I think I might accept it on one condition. Reynolds raised an eyebrow questioningly. That you be assigned as my liaison officer, Mac said. If I'm going to teach what I know, I want to make sure it's being received by someone who understands its value. A slow smile spread across Reynolds' face. It would be an honor, Mr. McAllister. Mac nodded, the decision feeling right. Perhaps this was why he had been drawn back to the base after all these years. Not just to be near the world he had left behind, but to pass something on before it was lost forever. One more thing, Lieutenant, Mac added. If we're going to work together, you should probably go and call me Mac. Mr. McAllister makes me feel even older than I am. Reynolds grinned. Only if you'll call me Jason, sir. We'll see, Mac replied with the faintest hint of a smile. You haven't earned that yet. As Reynolds departed, Mac remained on his porch contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. For decades, he had kept his past locked away as securely sealed as the classified files that documented his service. Now, circumstances had conspired to bring that past to light again. He thought of Whiskey and Doc, their faces still clear in his memory, despite the passage of time. He thought of the compass and the letter preserved in their box like artifacts from another life. And he thought of the young men training at the base, Lieutenant Reynolds among them, who might benefit from the hard-won knowledge he had carried alone for so long. Maybe it's time, he said aloud to the night air, as if his old teammates might be listening. Maybe it's finally time. With that, Mac rose from his chair and went inside, moving with purpose toward the locked room he had avoided for so many years. The key, which he had carried daily but never used, felt heavy in his hand. Some ghosts, he had told Colonel Franklin, were best left undisturbed. But perhaps some needed to be confronted at last, not to exorcise them, but to make peace with their presence. Mac inserted the key in the lock and turned it, the mechanism releasing with a soft click that echoed like thunder in the quiet house. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a small room preserved like a time capsule from another era. Maps of the Korean peninsula covered one wall. Black and white photographs showed three young men in swim trunks, muscled and lean, grinning with the immortal confidence of youth. Display cases held patches and insignia, some official, others not. And on a small table in the center of the room sat a wooden box polished by years of careful handling. Mac approached it slowly, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. With steady hands that belied his age, he opened the box and looked upon its contents for the first time in decades. There lay Whiskey's compass, its brass case tarnished but still intact. Beside it, yellowed with age but sealed with wax, was the letter. The promise the three men had made to each other on a beach in the Pacific under stars that had long since burned out. Mac lifted the letter carefully, feeling its weight in more than just physical terms. Tomorrow he would read it. Tomorrow he would begin the process of sharing what he knew with a new generation. But for tonight, he simply sat in the presence of his memories, no longer running from them, but embracing them as part of who he was. Not just Richard and McAllister, the janitor, but Mac, the frogman, the survivor, the keeper of a legacy that deserved to be remembered. Dawn broke over San Diego Bay with a brilliance that turned the water to liquid gold. Mac sat on his porch watching the light change as it had for countless mornings before. But this morning was different. The sealed letter from Whiskey and Doc lay open in his weathered hands, its yellowed paper covered in faded ink, the handwriting so familiar it made his chest ache. He had read it by lamplight in the pre-dawn hours, unable to sleep after finally opening the locked room and confronting the artifacts of his past. The words on the page were simple but profound, written by young men who somehow understood the weight of what they were undertaking. If you're reading this alone, brother, then we didn't make it back. Don't waste your life mourning us. Live for all three of us. And when the time comes, pass on what we stood for. The mission doesn't end when we do. Mac carefully folded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket close to his heart. 75 years he had carried the burden of survival, being the one who returned when his brothers did not. 75 years of quiet service and self-imposed anonymity. Perhaps it was time finally to fulfill the last part of their pact. His morning routine remained unchanged despite the emotional upheaval of recent days. Black coffee, a moment of silence for Margaret, the drive to the base in his aging Ford Ranger. But as he pulled into his usual parking space at the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, he noticed an unexpected vehicle waiting nearby. Colonel Franklin's official car, the small flags on the fenders fluttering in the morning breeze. Franklin himself stood beside it, ramrod straight in his service khakis, waiting. As Mac approached, the colonel did not salute, a concession to Mac's discomfort with formal recognition, but he did offer a respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. McAllister," Franklin said. "Colonel," Mac acknowledged. "You're here early." "Important day," Franklin replied. "I wanted to catch you before you started your shift." He paused, studying Mac's face. "Have you made a decision about our proposal?" Mac nodded. "I have. I'll do it on two conditions." Franklin raised an eyebrow, waiting. "First, I work with Lieutenant Reynolds as my liaison officer." The colonel's surprise was evident. "Reynolds, after how he treated you?" "Sometimes the ones who need the lessons most are the hardest to teach," Mac said, "but also the most worth teaching." Franklin considered this, then nodded. "And your second condition?" "No ceremony, no formal recognition, no press. What I share with your operators and trainees, not with the public. A smile touched the corner of Franklin's mouth. Agreed on both counts. Though I must warn you, Admiral Reynolds, Jason's father, has caught wind of this development and has expressed a desire to meet you. Mac frowned slightly. The Admiral can wait. First, I need to see what these young SEALs of yours are capable of. When would you like to start? Mac looked toward the training compound, where early morning activities were already underway. The sounds of instructors shouting commands and trainees responding in unison carried across the yard. Today, he said simply, but first I need to clean out my supply closet. I don't leave a box unfinished. Franklin nodded, respecting the older man's dedication to completing his responsibilities, however humble they might seem. I'll have personnel prepare a classroom and gather the necessary materials, and I'll inform Lieutenant Reynolds of his new assignment. As Franklin departed, Mac continued to the maintenance building, where he methodically organized his cleaning supplies and wrote detailed instructions for whoever would take over his duties. There was dignity in this work, a lesson he hoped to impart to the young operators he would soon be teaching. 2 hours later, Mac stood before a group of 30 Navy SEALs and trainees in one of the base's classroom buildings. The room fell silent as he entered, the men straightening instinctively in their seats. At the back of the room stood Master Chief Hayes, arms crossed, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. Near the front, Lieutenant Reynolds sat with a notebook open before him, his expression a mixture of anticipation and lingering shame. Colonel Franklin made a brief introduction, explaining Mac's new role without delving into the classified details of his service. He simply stated that Mac had been a member of an elite UDT unit during Korea and would be sharing specialized knowledge of underwater combat tactics. As Franklin concluded and turned the floor over to him, Mac surveyed the room. These were among the most elite warriors in the world's most powerful navy, equipped with technology and resources that would have seemed like science fiction during his active service. And yet, looking at their faces, some eager, some skeptical, all curious, he saw the same essential qualities he had recognized in Whiskey and Doc all those years ago. The hunger to serve, the willingness to endure hardship, the brotherhood that transcended ordinary bonds. Gentlemen, Mac began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. I'm not here to lecture you on naval history or tell war stories. I'm here because the fundamentals of underwater combat haven't changed in 75 years, despite all your advanced equipment. He moved to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. In precise angular handwriting, he wrote 3 words: cold, dark, breath. These are your constant enemies beneath the surface. He continued, turning back to face them. More dangerous than any human adversary. Modern wetsuits and rebreathers obviously give you advantages we never had, but they can fail. When they do, these 3 enemies will be waiting. For the next hour, Mac outlined techniques for extending underwater endurance that had been developed by the UDT units through brutal trial and error. Methods for conserving body heat without thermal protection. Navigation techniques that relied on natural indicators rather than GPS. Ways to control panic when equipment failed in hostile conditions. The SEALs listened with increasing attention, many taking notes, some exchanging glances that shifted from initial skepticism to growing respect. These were not theoretical concepts from a manual, but hard-earned knowledge from actual operations. Your modern equipment is valuable, Mac acknowledged, but over-reliance creates vulnerability. Every piece of technology you carry is a potential point of failure. The most reliable tool you have is the one between your ears. As the session concluded, Mac opened the floor to questions. Hands shot up immediately. The operators, initially reserved, now engaged, eagerly pressing for details, seeking clarification, hungry for the knowledge this unexpected mentor offered. Mac answered each question directly and thoroughly, demonstrating a command of underwater tactics that transcended the technological gap between his era and theirs. When technical questions arose about modern equipment, he deferred to Hayes, creating a seamless partnership between old wisdom and new application. Throughout the session, Mac noticed Reynolds watching intently, absorbing every word. The young lieutenant's arrogance had been replaced by genuine attentiveness, his notebook filling with observations and diagrams. After the classroom portion ended, the group moved to the base's training pool for practical demonstration. Mac removed his shoes and socks and rolled up his pant legs, but otherwise remained in his civilian clothes. Despite his age, he moved with the deliberate economy of motion that characterized career combat swimmers. Water temperature is the first enemy, Mac explained as the operators gathered around the pool's edge. Modern wetsuits give you protection, but dependence creates weakness. Today, we'll work without them. A murmur ran through the group. The pool was maintained at 68 degrees, comfortable for training, but cold enough for extended immersion to become challenging. I'll demonstrate breath control techniques first, Mac said. Then you'll practice in pairs while I observe. Without further ceremony, he slid into the water, barely creating a ripple. The SEALs watched as this 78-year-old man settled at the pool's bottom in 12 feet of water, cross-legged, completely still, eyes open and alert. 1 minute passed, then 2. At 3 minutes, some of the younger operators exchanged impressed glances. At 4 minutes, even Hayes raised an eyebrow. When Mac finally surfaced at 4 minutes and 37 seconds, he did so without gasping or displaying any signs of oxygen deprivation. He simply rose to the surface and took a controlled breath. That's without hyperventilation or any other preparation, Hayes commented to the group. Standard combat swimmer qualification requires 3 minutes. Mac pulled himself out of the pool with surprising strength for his age, water streaming from his clothes. Your turn, he said simply. Lieutenant Reynolds, you first. Reynolds, caught off guard at being singled out, quickly stripped to his swim shorts and slid into the water. Under Mac's watchful eye, he attempted to replicate the demonstration, focusing on the breathing techniques Mac had described. He managed 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Respectable, but far short of Mac's performance. As Reynolds surfaced, Mac nodded. Good start. You're fighting the water. Stop fighting. Accept it. Become part of it. For the next 2 hours, Mac worked with each pair of operators, correcting technique, demonstrating adjustments, pushing them to extend their capabilities beyond what they thought possible. His teaching style was direct but patient, demanding excellence without berating failure. By session's end, even the most experienced SEALs had gained new insights. What had begun as a courtesy to an elderly veteran had transformed into valuable training from a master of the craft. The respect in the room was palpable, no longer granted because of Mac's age or historical significance, but earned through demonstrated expertise. As the group prepared to depart, Mac pulled Reynolds aside. Meet me at the obstacle course tomorrow at 0000. Bring a notebook and wear something you don't mind getting wet and muddy. Reynolds nodded, a hint of his old confidence returning, but tempered now with genuine respect. Yes, sir. I'll be there. The following morning, Mac arrived at the obstacle course to find Reynolds already waiting, dressed in standard PT gear, notebook in hand, as instructed. The sky was still dark, the air cool and damp with marine fog rolling in from the Pacific. Good morning, Lieutenant, Mac said. Morning, sir, Reynolds replied. Ready for whatever you have planned. Mac gestured toward the obstacle course, a grueling series of walls, ropes, tunnels, and balance challenges designed to test both strength and agility. This course was designed to build individual physical prowess, he said. Important, but incomplete. Incomplete how, sir? It doesn't teach you how to keep your team alive when everything goes wrong. Mac's eyes grew distant for a moment. That's the lesson that matters most, and it's the hardest to teach. He led Reynolds to a small equipment shed near the course and unlocked it, revealing a collection of weighted vests, masks, and other training aids. Put this on, he said, handing Reynolds a 20-pound vest. As Reynolds complied, Mac continued. The colonel tells me you're highly regarded for your physical abilities. Top of your class in most measurable categories. Yes, sir, Reynolds acknowledged without the preening pride that would have accompanied such a statement days earlier. And yet you struggle with team leadership scenarios. Your peer evaluations indicate you tend to outpace your team rather than elevate them. Mac's assessment was blunt, but delivered without judgment. Reynolds looked surprised, then chagrined. Those evaluations are supposed to be confidential. Colonel Franklin thought I should know who I'm working with, Mac replied, both strengths and weaknesses. Before Reynolds could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. A transport truck was pulling up, and from it emerged a group of SEAL trainees in the early phases of qualification, looking exhausted and cold after what had clearly been a night of intense training. Ah, right on time, Mac said. I asked the instructors if we could borrow some of their students this morning. The trainees lined up bleary-eyed but standing at attention. Their instructor, a hard-faced chief petty officer, approached Mac and Reynolds. Mr. McAllister, the chief said respectfully, these men have been going for 18 hours straight. They've had no sleep, minimal food, and have already completed 2 evolution cycles. Mac nodded. Perfect. Thank you, Chief. As the instructor departed, Mac turned to Reynolds. Lieutenant, these men are at their physical and mental limits. Your task is to lead them through the obstacle course. Everyone must finish, and you must finish last. Reynolds frowned. Last, sir. A leader ensures all his people make it before he does, Mac said simply. Go. What followed was a grueling lesson in leadership. The exhausted trainees struggled with even the simplest obstacles. Reynolds, accustomed to excelling individually, had to completely reorient his approach. Instead of demonstrating his superior abilities, he had to find ways to motivate and support men who were on the verge of collapse. Mac watched from various vantage points, occasionally offering terse guidance, but mostly letting Reynolds work through the challenge on his own. He observed as the lieutenant gradually shifted his focus from completion of the course to the welfare of his temporary team. When one trainee became stuck on the rope climb, too exhausted to pull himself up, Reynolds positioned himself beneath the man, bracing his feet and pushing upward while offering encouragement. When another began showing signs of heat exhaustion despite the cool morning, Reynolds ordered a brief rest period and shared his own water supply. What should have taken 45 minutes stretched into 2 hours. By the end, Reynolds was covered in mud, his knuckles bleeding, his muscles trembling with exertion. But every trainee had completed the course, and true to the instruction, Reynolds was the last to cross the finish line. As the trainees were dismissed to their regular training schedule, Reynolds approached Mac, breathing heavily but standing straight. Did I pass your test, sir? He asked. Mac studied him thoughtfully. There was no test, Lieutenant. Just a lesson. Did you learn it? Reynolds was quiet for a moment, processing the experience. I think so, he finally said. It's not about being the best. It's about making sure everyone makes it. Mac nodded. That's part of it. The rest you'll have to figure out for yourself. He gestured toward the base cafeteria. Let's get some coffee. You've earned it. Over steaming mugs in the quiet cafeteria, Mac shared more of his philosophy on leadership, drawn not from manuals or theories, but from the crucible of actual combat operations. Reynolds listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed a deepening understanding. Sir, Reynolds said after a thoughtful pause, may I ask you something personal? Mac raised an eyebrow. You can ask, I might not answer. After what happened in Swanson Harbor, losing your team, how did you go on? How did you lead other men after that? The question hung in the air between them, weighty and significant. Max stared into his coffee for a long moment before responding. I almost didn't, he admitted quietly. After I was discharged, I spent 2 years barely functioning. Drank too much, isolated myself, blamed myself for their deaths, even though, logically, I knew they had made their own choices. He looked up, meeting Reynolds' gaze directly. What saved me was Margaret, my late wife. She didn't try to fix me or tell me to get over it. She just stayed, created a space where I could either heal or destroy myself. I chose healing eventually. And leading men again, that came later in a civilian capacity, construction crew foreman, different context, same principles. Mac's expression softened slightly. You never get over losing men under your command, Lieutenant. You just learn to carry it in a way that honors them rather than destroys you. Reynolds nodded slowly, absorbing this hard truth. Thank you for sharing that, sir. I know it couldn't have been easy. Mac acknowledged this with a slight nod, then changed the subject. Colonel Franklin tells me you've been removed from DevGru selection consideration for this cycle. Reynolds straightened. Yes, sir. Part of my disciplinary action. How do you feel about that? Disappointed, Reynolds admitted, but I understand the reason. My behavior was unacceptable. Mac studied him. DevGru will still be there next cycle. In the meantime, you have an opportunity to develop aspects of leadership that can't be measured in physical tests or tactical exercises. I'm beginning to see that, sir. As they finished their coffee, Mac outlined his plans for the coming weeks. A comprehensive training program that would integrate traditional UDT techniques with modern SEAL capabilities. Reynolds would assist in developing the curriculum and would serve as the bridge between Mac and the current command structure. One more thing, Mac said as they prepared to leave. I understand your father has expressed interest in meeting me. Reynolds looked uncomfortable. Yes, sir. I apologize for that. After what happened, I felt obligated to tell him about you and the Phantom Trident unit. He's always been interested in naval special warfare history. It's fine, Mac assured him. I'll meet with him eventually, but first we have work to do here. The following weeks saw a transformation at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. What had begun as a one-off consultation evolved into a structured program that Colonel Franklin dubbed the Phantom Trident Initiative. 3 times a week, Mac led sessions combining classroom instruction with practical exercises, teaching the SEALs to function effectively when technology failed or was unavailable. Reynolds proved to be an effective liaison, translating Mac's old-school techniques into protocols compatible with modern operations. His own leadership style evolved visibly, becoming more focused on team capability than individual prowess. The arrogant lieutenant who had confronted an elderly janitor was fading, replaced by a more thoughtful officer who understood that true strength lay in elevating those around him. Mac, for his part, found unexpected satisfaction in teaching. Decades of accumulated knowledge previously locked away with his memories now found purpose. In sharing what he knew, he was fulfilling the final request of his long-lost teammates. 4 weeks into the program, a scheduled underwater navigation exercise was underway in the bay adjacent to the base. Mac observed from a patrol boat as teams of SEALs practiced navigating preset courses using only natural indicators, current patterns, bottom composition, and temperature gradients, rather than electronic aids. Reynolds was monitoring the exercise from the water, serving as a safety observer. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near one of the training buoys. A trainee had become entangled in some underwater debris, his equipment snagged and his movement restricted. Before the safety divers could respond, Reynolds was moving, cutting through the water with powerful strokes. Mac watched intently as the lieutenant reached the struggling trainee and assessed the situation. Rather than immediately trying to free the man, Reynolds first ensured his breathing apparatus was functioning and that he remained calm. Only then did he methodically work to release the entanglement. The incident was resolved quickly and without injury, but Mac had seen enough to recognize genuine progress. Reynolds had prioritized the welfare of his man over the rapid resolution of the problem, a fundamental principle of combat leadership. As the exercise concluded and the teams returned to shore, Mac approached Reynolds, who was toweling off after his impromptu rescue. "Good work out there, Lieutenant," Mac said. "You handled that correctly." Reynolds nodded, accepting the rare praise without preening. "Just applied what you've been teaching us, sir." "No," Mac countered. "You applied what you've been learning. There's a difference." Later that afternoon, Mac was summoned to Colonel Franklin's office. He arrived to find not only Franklin, but also Master Chief Hayes, and unexpectedly a tall man in an admiral's uniform, his chest adorned with rows of service ribbons, his cover resting on Franklin's desk. The resemblance to Lieutenant Reynolds was unmistakable. "Mr. McAllister," Franklin said, rising as Mac entered, "may I introduce Admiral James Reynolds, Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command." "Admiral, this is Richard McAllister." Admiral Reynolds stepped forward, his hand extended. "Mr. McAllister, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard remarkable things about the program you're developing here." Mac shook the offered hand, studying the Admiral's face. He saw in it echoes of the sun, the same strong jawline, the same intensity, but also a weathering that only came from years of command responsibility. "Admiral," Mac acknowledged, "your son has been instrumental in implementing the program. You should be proud of him." Something flashed in Reynolds Sr.'s eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "Jason has mentioned how much he's learning from you. It seems you've made quite an impression on him." "The impression was mutual," Mac said diplomatically, not elaborating on their inauspicious first meeting. The Admiral's expression grew more serious. "Mr. McAllister, I've taken the liberty of making some inquiries about your service record. My security clearance allows access to files that even Colonel Franklin can't see." Mac tensed slightly. "The Phantom Trident operations remain classified, Admiral." "Yes and no," Reynolds replied. "The operational details are still restricted, but the existence of the unit has been declassified as of last week. I personally signed the authorization." Mac raised an eyebrow, questioning. "The history of naval special warfare shouldn't be lost," the Admiral explained. "Your unit represents a crucial evolutionary link between the UDT Frogmen and the modern SEAL teams. That legacy deserves recognition. Mac remained silent, uncertain where this was heading. Franklin stepped in. Admiral Reynolds has a proposal, Mac, one I think you should consider. The Admiral nodded. I'd like to establish a permanent training module based on your Phantom Trident initiative, not just here at Coronado, but at all Spec War training facilities, preserving and transmitting the fundamental skills that remain essential despite technological advances. Mac considered this. The program he had been developing with Reynolds had value he knew. But expanding it across the entire Spec War community was a much larger undertaking. I'm 78 years old, Admiral, he said pragmatically. I don't know how many years of active teaching I have left, which is exactly why we need to institutionalize your knowledge now, Reynolds countered. We'd provide you with a team of instructors who would learn directly from you, ensuring the continuity of the program long after. He didn't complete the sentence, but the implication was clear. Mac glanced at Hayes, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. And who would lead this team of instructors? Mac asked, though he already suspected the answer. Lieutenant Reynolds has volunteered, the Admiral confirmed, pending your approval, of course. Mac almost smiled at the irony. The young officer who had dismissed him as an irrelevant old man would now be tasked with preserving and propagating his legacy. Life had a way of coming full circle. I'll consider it, Mac said, but I'd need to discuss it with the lieutenant first. This needs to be his choice, not an assignment. Admiral Reynolds nodded, respecting Mac's condition. Of course, he's currently supervising the trainees' evening evolution. He should be finished by 2,000 hours. The meeting concluded with the understanding that Mac would provide his decision within the week. As he left the administration building, the sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. He walked slowly toward the beach, finding a quiet spot where he could watch the last light fade from the horizon. The sound of footsteps on sand alerted him to another presence. Lieutenant Reynolds approached, still in his wet training gear, his hair damp from the ocean. Master Chief Hayes told me you wanted to see me, sir, Reynolds said, coming to stand beside Mac. Your father is here, Mac said without preamble. He has an interesting proposal involving you and me. Reynolds nodded. He mentioned he wanted to discuss something with you. Said it might be a way to make amends for my behavior. This isn't about amends, Lieutenant, Mac said firmly. It's about the future. Your father wants to expand our training program across all Spec War facilities with you as the lead instructor under my guidance. Reynolds was silent for a moment, processing this. What did you tell him? That I needed to discuss it with you first. Mac turned to face the younger man directly. This isn't an order or an assignment. It needs to be something you believe in, something you choose. Reynolds looked out at the darkening ocean, considering. 4 weeks ago, I would have seen this as a consolation prize, something to tide me over until I could reapply for DevGru selection. He paused. Now I'm not so sure. Explain, Mac prompted. DevGru is the pinnacle of individual operator capability, Reynolds said slowly. But this program, it's about ensuring that every SEAL, regardless of unit assignment, has the fundamental skills to survive and complete the mission when technology fails. It could save lives across the entire community. Mac nodded, pleased with the lieutenant's perspective. If you agree to continue as the program's foundation, Reynolds continued, then yes, I would be honored to lead the instructor cadre. Mac extended his hand. Then we have an agreement, Lieutenant. As they shook hands, the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear over the Pacific. The same stars Mac reflected that had guided him and his teammates on that fateful night off the coast of Korea so many years ago. Later that evening, Mac returned to his small bungalow and sat once more on his porch, contemplating how completely his life had changed in the space of a few weeks. From anonymous janitor to the cornerstone of a new Spec War training initiative, a journey he could never have anticipated. He removed the yellowed letter from his pocket and read it again by the porch light. The words of Whiskey and Doc seemed to speak directly to this moment, as if they had somehow known that one day he would find his way back to the world they had left behind. The mission doesn't end when we do. Mac carefully refolded the letter. Tomorrow he would tell Admiral Reynolds that he accepted the proposal. Tomorrow he would begin the process of ensuring that the knowledge and skills of the Phantom Trident unit would not be lost to history, but would instead continue to serve the nation through generations of operators yet to come. And perhaps in doing so, he would finally complete the mission his teammates had entrusted to him 75 years ago on a beach in the Pacific. Not just to survive, but to ensure that what they stood for endured. Mac looked up at the stars bright and eternal in the clear night sky. Mission accepted, he whispered to his long-lost brothers. Mission accepted.